Hello and welcome back to Family Shadows, a place where stories of quiet justice, family struggles, and the strength of love across generations find their voice. If you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for being part of our growing family. If you're new here, I hope you'll stay a while, subscribe, and join a community that believes in the power of stories, stories that remind us of what truly matters. Blessings to you and yours. Tonight's story is called, "While my son was fighting for his life in the hospital, his wife was busy celebrating a birthday. An hour later, she faced the truth. The beeping of machines has its own rhythm, one that a father never wishes to memorize. Yet that night, John Miller knew every sound in the room by heart. The steady tick of the heart monitor, the low hum of oxygen, the faint shuffle of nurses' shoes beyond the curtain. He sat hunched in the stiff hospital chair, his old denim jacket pulled tight around him, as if cloth could ward off the cold truth hanging in the air. His son, David, lay still on the bed. Tubes, wires, monitors, things John had once only seen in medical dramas on TV, were now tethered to the boy he had raised with calloused hands and stubborn love. At 35, David had always seemed larger than life. Tall, athletic, reckless in ways John could never be. He remembered the boy on a high school baseball field, swinging a bat like he wanted to send every ball out of the park. He remembered the young man who once stood in his garage and announced he was going to build his own construction business. But tonight, all of that seemed so far away. John's hand rested over his son's, pale and limp on the white sheet. He whispered almost to himself, "You're a fighter, son. You always were. Don't you quit on me now." Outside the window, the city never slept. Neon lights flickered across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, life was continuing as if nothing inside this hospital mattered. John thought of all the people in restaurants, bars, and homes, laughing over meals, blowing out candles, singing songs. The contrast burned inside him. His whole world had shrunk to this sterile room, this fragile heartbeat, this silent battle between life and death. Then his phone buzzed. It wasn't a doctor, not a nurse, not a relative asking about David. It was a notification from Facebook. John hesitated before unlocking it. He wasn't much for social media. His wife, before she passed, used to tease him that he still lived in the age of Polaroids. But sometimes it was the only way to see what his daughter-in-law was up to. The screen lit up with a smiling face. Ashley, David's wife. She was in a red dress, hair curled, glass of champagne raised in her hand. Around her, a crowd of friends shouted, "Happy birthday." Someone had tagged her in a post. "Ashley looking stunning tonight. What a party." The photo was time-stamped just minutes earlier. John stared at it, his throat tightened. His hand trembled so badly he nearly dropped the phone. His son was lying in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life. And his wife, his supposed partner, his supposed source of comfort, was out celebrating her birthday like nothing was happening. John swallowed hard. He put the phone down on his lap and rubbed his face with both hands. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength, because right now I don't understand this. I don't understand her." He looked at David again, his boy, the one who once called him old man in a half-joking, half-admiring way, the one who once asked him to teach him how to fix an engine even though David's hands were built more for blueprints than for bolts. And he thought, does he know? Does he have any idea, even in his coma, that the woman he loved is somewhere else, not here, not holding his hand, not fighting for him? The thought was almost too much to bear. John leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and for a moment let the weight of years press down on him. He was 62, and though he was strong for his age, he still chopped his own wood, still fixed his neighbors' porches. He suddenly felt old, not in his body but in his heart, old from carrying too many burdens alone. His wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years earlier after a long illness. He had sat in another hospital then, just like this, holding her hand until her breath slipped away. He thought that would be the hardest night of his life. But watching his son fight for breath while his daughter-in-law danced with friends, it felt like a different kind of wound. Not sharp like death, but dull and grinding like betrayal. The beeping of the machines pulled him back. He opened his eyes, cleared his throat, and whispered again to David, "Your old man's right here. I won't leave you, not for anything, not for anyone." Then his phone buzzed again. Another notification, another photo. This time Ashley was blowing out candles. Her friends clapped. The caption read, "32 never looked so good. Cheers to another year of fabulous living." John's jaw clenched. He turned the phone face down on the chair. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just a missed moment. It was a choice. She had chosen celebration over devotion, vanity over loyalty, comfort over sacrifice. And John, sitting in the harsh, fluorescent glow of the ICU, felt something stir deep inside him. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just grief, it was resolve. The night dragged on with no rhythm but the one dictated by machines. John Miller sat unmoving except for the nervous twitch of his fingers against his thigh. He had grown up in a world where men fixed what was broken, wooden fences, leaking faucets, dented truck doors. But here, in this sterile place, there was nothing for his hands to mend. His son's broken body was far beyond the reach of a wrench or a hammer. The nurses came and went, their voices calm, practiced. They adjusted tubes, recorded numbers, whispered to one another. John barely heard them. His eyes drifted back to the phone he had set face down on the chair. The thing glowed again, buzzing against the vinyl cushion. For a long moment he refused to look, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, tugged at him. With a sigh, he picked it up. Another photo. Ashley again, smiling, her arm looped around a friend's shoulder, cake crumbs on her plate. The caption, "Best birthday yet, surrounded by love and laughter." John's stomach turned, surrounded by love. His son lay tethered to machines, surrounded by antiseptic and grief, and Ashley called this night the best of her life. He pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting the anger that swelled in his chest. It wasn't just that she wasn't here. It was the way she flaunted her absence. It was the way she turned her husband's darkest hour into a backdrop for her own spotlight. He scrolled without meaning to, each photo like a blow. Ashley clinking glasses. Ashley blowing kisses to the camera. Ashley leaning across a table lit with candles, as if nothing in her world was wrong. John's mind wandered back to years before, when Margaret was alive. Birthdays had been simple then, homemade cakes, a hand-stitched banner hung across the dining room, laughter that came not from proving something to the world, but from belonging to it. David had grown up in that atmosphere of quiet celebrations, where love mattered more than appearances. What would Margaret say now if she could see this? John lifted his eyes toward the ceiling, whispering under his breath, "Maggie, you know what to do. You always did." The phone buzzed again, a video this time. Music pounded through tinny speakers, people chanting Ashley's name. A slow-motion clip of her laughing, tilting her head back, holding a glass high. Comments flooded in. "Queen of the night. Living your best life." John's thumb hovered over the screen. He wanted to smash the phone against the wall, to shout at strangers who praised a woman celebrating while his son clung to life. Instead, he locked the screen, set the phone down, and pressed his palm to his forehead. The hospital clock ticked past midnight. The hallways grew quieter, the bustle giving way to the eerie stillness of night. John stood and stretched, bones creaking, and walked to the small window overlooking the city. Down below, headlights streamed like fireflies along the interstate. Somewhere in that endless grid of lights, Ashley laughed and danced. He whispered again, but this time not to Margaret, this time to God. "Keep him safe, Lord. If I must sit here alone, so be it, but keep him safe." Behind him, the machines carried on their vigil, and though John's body remained in that hospital room, his thoughts wandered between the past he longed for and the present he could hardly endure, bound by photos he wished he could forget but could not escape. By the time dawn broke, the waiting room outside the intensive care unit was painted with a tired gray light. The vending machines hummed, the coffee in paper cups had gone stale, and the people slouched in plastic chairs all shared the same weary look. John Miller sat among them, his jacket pulled close, the brim of his old baseball cap shadowing his face. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the images returned, the flashing lights of the ambulance, David's pale face, the photos of Ashley raising a glass while her husband fought for his life. Sleep was impossible when the heart was this heavy. The glass door slid open. John looked up and saw her. Ashley. She walked in as if she belonged, though the smell of perfume and the faint trace of alcohol clung to her clothes. Her hair was curled, but not neatly now, more like the aftermath of a night stretched too long. Sunglasses covered her eyes, though the morning sun was barely awake. John's jaw tightened. She spotted him, hesitated for only a breath, then crossed the room. "John," she said, her voice flat, rehearsed. "How's he doing?" John studied her face. He saw no tears, no sleepless worry etched into her features, only the mild impatience of someone checking a box. He swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "He's hanging on," he said, his voice hoarse. "Barely." Ashley sighed as if she were hearing about a missed appointment instead of a husband fighting for breath. She sat across from him, legs crossed, scrolling her phone. "Hospitals stress me out," she muttered. "You know that I needed to step away last night." "Step away?" John's voice carried the low rumble of a storm. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "While he was hooked up to machines, you were what? Blowing out candles, laughing with friends." Ashley's sunglasses slipped slightly as she looked up, her lips tightening. "It was my birthday, John. Am I supposed to cancel my life every time something happens? David wouldn't want me miserable." John's eyes narrowed. His weathered hands gripped together until the knuckles went white. "Your life," he repeated softly, but the softness was dangerous. "David's life is lying in that room. Miserable is the last word I'd use for what he's enduring." Ashley waved a dismissive hand. "You don't get it. Stress makes me sick. If I'm sick, I'm no good to him either. At least I came this morning." John sat back, forcing himself to breathe, to keep from saying what he truly wanted to. He thought of Margaret, his late wife, who once stayed in a hospital chair for weeks during her own father's decline. She never left his side. Love had meant staying, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how hard. "You came," John said finally, his voice low. "But not for him, you came to be seen." The words hung in the air like frost. Ashley shifted in her seat, tugging at her coat, adjusting her sunglasses. She didn't deny it. For a moment, silence filled the waiting room. Other families looked away, pretending not to notice the quiet battle unfolding. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse paged a doctor. The world carried on, but in that corner, time seemed to stand still. Finally, Ashley stood. "I'll check in later," she said, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. Just keep me updated if anything changes." John didn't rise, he didn't nod, he didn't promise her anything. He simply looked past her through the glass toward the ICU, toward his son. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Ashley turned, heels clicking against the tile, and walked out the same way she had come, perfume trailing behind her, a scent out of place in the world of antiseptic and sorrow. John exhaled slowly, his hands unclenched. He leaned forward again, elbows heavy on his knees, and let the weight of disappointment settle deep in his bones. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, almost a vow, "He deserves better. My boy deserves better." And as the morning sun rose higher over the city, John knew something inside him had shifted. It was not just grief anymore. It was the beginning of a resolve, forged in silence, tempered by betrayal. When the automatic doors closed behind Ashley, the waiting room exhaled a strange kind of quiet. John Miller stayed in his chair, staring at the linoleum floor, but his mind was far away. He had always believed sacrifice was best carried in silence. His father taught him that in a Midwestern town where men worked until their backs gave out, where they fixed roofs on Sunday afternoons and mowed not just their own yards but the widows down the street. John thought of his old truck. It had been his companion for almost 20 years, a battered Ford with more dents than smooth lines, but reliable as a loyal dog. He had built shelves in the back, carried lumber, driven it to job sites, and once used it to haul David's first set of baseball bats when the boy joined Little League. That truck was part of the family in its own way. Margaret had joked that he treated it like a second son. But 3 months ago, when David's medical bills began stacking like bricks on his kitchen table, John had sold it. He'd stood in his driveway watching a stranger drive away, the taillights shrinking into the dusk. He had told no one, not even David. He simply pocketed the modest check, drove straight to the hospital, and cleared another portion of debt. Now he walked everywhere, or borrowed a neighbor's car when he couldn't. He remembered how Ashley had once mentioned to her friends at dinner in that breezy way of hers, "Oh, it's been tough, but I've been managing all the hospital bills. It hasn't been easy." John had sat at the table then, sipping water, letting her words hang in the air. He hadn't corrected her. Pride wasn't the point. His son's life was. Still, the lie had burned. In his jacket pocket, he carried a thick envelope, creased, worn soft at the edges. Inside were receipts, thousands of dollars in payments, each signed with his shaky penmanship. There were insurance forms, copies of his pension withdrawals, even the paperwork from selling his truck. Proof of what love looked like when no one else was watching. Sometimes, late at night when he was alone in his small house, John would spread those papers across the kitchen table. He would stare at the numbers until they blurred, whispering to Margaret's photo on the wall, "I'm doing what I can, Maggie. I'm keeping him alive, even if no one knows but us." Now, in this sterile waiting room, he reached into his pocket, touched the envelope, and felt its reassuring weight. He thought back to the garage where he had once worked overtime so David could go to college. He thought of the nights he'd come home with sawdust still in his hair, only to spend hours fixing up David's science projects because the boy had a big imagination but clumsy hands. He thought of Margaret sewing late into the night, and how they used to whisper about building a future for their son that was brighter than their own. All of it, all those years of giving, seemed to circle back to this moment. The fight for his son's life. John stood and walked toward the ICU doors, where a nurse in blue scrubs paused to check her clipboard. "Mr. Miller," she said kindly. He's stable for now. It's touch and go, but stable. John nodded, his throat too tight for words. As he returned to his seat, he passed the glass door where Ashley had entered hours before. The faint trace of her perfume still lingered. He thought of her friends raising glasses, their careless cheers, their shouts of happy birthday, while his son lay in a tangle of wires. John gripped the envelope in his pocket. His hands shook, not with weakness but with a sense of purpose. There would come a time, he knew, when the truth inside that envelope would matter, when lies would collapse under the weight of paper and ink, when everyone would see who had truly carried the burden. But not yet. For now he would remain silent. He would sit, he would wait, he would pray. Because sacrifice, he believed, wasn't meant to be announced. It was meant to be lived. And John Miller, weary though he was, had lived it all his life. The day bled into afternoon and afternoon into evening. Hospitals had a way of erasing time. No sunrise, no sunset, only the rhythm of machines and the weary shuffle of nurses changing shifts. John Miller sat in his chair, a styrofoam cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. He had prayed silently, counted the beeps on the monitor, and whispered words of encouragement into ears that might not hear. Then the door opened and Dr. Harris stepped inside. Dr. Harris was a tall man with a thinning crown of hair, his white coat draped like a weary flag. He carried a folder in one hand and the weight of difficult news in the other. He glanced at John first, then at Ashley, who had returned late that afternoon, her phone in her hand, makeup freshened as though she had an audience to face. "Mr. Miller," the doctor began, voice steady but grave, "your son's condition is deteriorating. His lungs aren't responding to treatment the way we hoped. We need to consider an advanced surgical intervention." The words dropped heavy in the room, louder than the machines. John's heart lurched, but he kept his face still. He had lived long enough to know panic helped no one. "What does it mean?" Ashley asked, arms folded. Her tone was clipped, businesslike. Dr. Harris cleared his throat. "It means we need to act quickly. It's high risk, but without it, I'm not confident David will pull through." Silence stretched. John lowered his coffee, staring at the doctor, trying to absorb the words. Advanced surgery, high risk. Without it, his son might not see tomorrow. "How much will it cost?" Ashley cut in. The words were sharp, jarring, like someone dropping a glass in a church. John's eyes snapped to her, his pulse quickened. "Excuse me," Dr. Harris asked, blinking. Ashley uncrossed her arms, adjusted her coat. "I mean, obviously, we need to think about cost. If it's something experimental or not covered by insurance, I don't want us drowning in debt. David wouldn't want that either." John rose from his chair, slowly, deliberately. His shoulders, bent from hours of vigil, straightened. His voice, when it came, was low, almost trembling, not with weakness but with fury contained. "You're talking about money," he said, each word measured, "while my boy is lying there fighting for his life." Ashley flinched but held her ground. "I'm being practical, John. Someone has to think about the future. We can't just sign anything blindly. Surgery isn't cheap if it fails." "If it fails," John cut her off, stepping closer, "then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know we didn't let him slip away because we were too busy counting dollars." His voice rose, breaking the silence of the room. The other families in the waiting area turned their heads. Ashley glanced around, flustered. "Keep your voice down," she hissed. But John didn't. He couldn't. He felt Margaret's absence like a weight on his chest, her memory urging him to speak. He felt every year of sacrifice, every dollar scraped together, every night spent alone at the kitchen table with bills spread like battlefield maps. "He's my son," John said, voice cracking now. "My only boy, and if you think I'll let him die because of a balance sheet, you don't know me at all." Ashley's mouth opened, but no words came. For once, the performance faltered. She looked down, fumbling with her phone as if it could shield her from the truth of his words. Dr. Harris shifted uncomfortably, but there was respect in his eyes as he turned back to John. "We'll need a decision soon," he said. "I'll give you some time." When the doctor left, silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Ashley sat rigid, staring at the floor. John stood by the window, staring out at the fading light. It was in that silence that John realized something had snapped. The dam he had built of patience and restraint had begun to crack. The truth he carried in his pocket, the envelope of receipts, the proof of sacrifice, suddenly felt less like paper and more like a weapon. A weapon he had no choice but to use, because there were breaking points in life, moments when silence became complicity. And John Miller, weary father, faithful husband, quiet man, had reached his. The night had thickened into a silence that felt heavier than stone. John Miller sat rigid in his chair, staring at the pale linoleum, the envelope pressing against his chest pocket like a secret that had grown too heavy to bear. Ashley had dozed off in the corner, her phone still clutched in her hand, the blue glow flickering across her face. John hadn't closed his eyes in almost 2 days. His back ached, his hands trembled, but he stayed, because fathers stay. They stay when the world walks out, when comfort is easier elsewhere, when it costs them more than anyone could imagine. They stay. The ICU doors hissed open. Dr. Harris stepped out, his expression taut. He carried no clipboard this time, only urgency. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice low but firm, "it's time. We need consent for the procedure. We can't wait any longer." Ashley stirred, blinking herself awake. She sat upright, smoothed her hair, and without hesitation said, "I'll sign." John's head turned slowly toward her. "You'll sign." His voice was quiet, but the quiet was like the deep part of a river hiding strength beneath. "Yes," Ashley said, slipping her sunglasses up to rest on her head. "I'm his wife. That makes it my responsibility. We don't need to drag this out." Dr. Harris hesitated, his gaze flicking between them. John stood. The envelope crinkled as he drew it from his pocket. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to release. "You've called it your responsibility long enough," John said, his voice cutting through the sterile air. He slapped the envelope onto the small metal table beside them, the sound sharp as a gavel. "But the truth is right here." Ashley frowned. "What is that?" John's weathered fingers pulled the flap open. He drew out one paper, then another, spreading them like a dealer at a high-stakes table. Receipts stamped paid, insurance forms with his name signed at the bottom, withdrawal slips from his pension fund, the bill of sale for his beloved truck. The waiting room grew still. Even the family sitting nearby leaned in, sensing history in the making. "This," John said, voice breaking, "is every dime I've scraped, every sacrifice I've made. Not you, Ashley, not your friends, me. While you were posting pictures and raising glasses, I was selling the only truck I ever owned just to keep my boy breathing." Ashley's mouth fell open. "That's not true, You what?" John's eyes flashed. "You told people you were covering the bills, that you were managing everything. You lied. You wore my sacrifices like they were your badge. And you dare stand here now, ready to sign papers that decide his life." Ashley stammered, her face pale beneath the makeup. The phone in her hand buzzed with another notification. Another message from the world she had chosen over her husband's bedside. She silenced it quickly, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Dr. Harris cleared his throat. Mr. Miller, if what you're saying is true, then by record of financial responsibility and insurance, you're the legal guardian of decision-making. These forms confirm it. He lifted one sheet, eyes scanning the signatures. He nodded. Yes, you have authority. John exhaled slowly, years of silence giving way to this moment of truth. He looked at Ashley one last time, not with anger now, but with a tired sadness. You wanted the spotlight, Ashley. Well, here it is. Everyone can see it now, not your stories, not your parties, the truth. Ashley's eyes darted around as if searching for rescue in the faces of strangers, but no one came to her defense, not this time. John turned back to Dr. Harris, his voice steadied. Do whatever it takes, save my boy. The doctor nodded, tucking the forms into his folder. We'll prepare him immediately. He disappeared through the sliding doors, leaving the hush of the waiting room in his wake. John gathered the scattered papers back into the envelope and pressed it to his chest. His knees felt weak, but his heart felt unburdened. He had not wanted this confrontation. He had not wanted to shame anyone. But there comes a moment when silence betrays the truth, and tonight he had chosen truth. Ashley sank back into her chair, silent at last, her world of glossy images crumbling under the raw weight of sacrifice. And John, weary though he was, sat down again, bowed his head, and whispered, "Fight, son, fight. Your old man's got you." The waiting room had grown crowded as the night stretched into morning. Aunts, cousins, neighbors, people who had heard about David's condition came shuffling in, carrying styrofoam cups and hushed prayers. John sat in his corner, the envelope of truth clutched in his lap, his back straight despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. Ashley had reappeared, this time with a small entourage of her friends who had drifted from the party into the hospital, their perfume still mingling with the antiseptic air. They spoke in whispers, glancing around, their faces painted with pity that looked more like performance than sincerity. When Dr. Harris emerged once again, the room seemed to hold its breath. He carried authority in his step, and the folder of forms under his arm was now sealed with signatures. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "David is being prepped for surgery. It will be hours before we know the outcome. In the meantime, I need to make something clear." His eyes swept the room. There has been confusion about medical authority. By all legal and financial documentation, Mr. John Miller, David's father, holds decision-making power. He has been the one sustaining these treatments. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes wide. Ashley's cheeks flushed crimson. "That's not," she began, but John rose before she could finish. He stood slowly, the way a man rises not just from a chair but from a lifetime of silence. His voice, when it came, was steady, worn by years but made sharper by truth. "You've all heard things," he said, his gaze moving from face to face. "You've heard that Ashley was paying the bills, that she was carrying the weight." He paused, holding the envelope aloft. "That's a lie." He opened the envelope again, spreading the receipts and forms across the low table in the center of the room. Pages fluttered under the air vents, stark black ink on white paper. "These are my signatures, my withdrawals, my sacrifices. I sold the truck I drove for 20 years. I emptied my pension. Every cent has come from these old hands." He held them up, hands scarred, veins visible, palms calloused from decades of labor. Not from parties, not from dinners out, not from empty words. The room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Ashley's friends shifted uncomfortably, their glossy confidence faltering under the weight of his words. One of them whispered, "Is that true?" But Ashley pressed her lips tight, unable to form an answer. John looked at her not with malice but with sorrow. You cared more about being seen than being here. You celebrated while your husband fought for breath, and you wore my sacrifices like a crown. His voice broke slightly, but crowns fall when the truth is spoken. For a long moment no one moved. The silence was heavy, holy, almost like the quiet after a prayer. Then John gathered the papers back into the envelope, slid it into his pocket, and lowered his gaze. I didn't want to speak, he said softly. I didn't want to shame anyone, but I will not let my son's fight be reduced to lies. Not here, not now. Ashley sat frozen, her eyes glassy, her face stripped of the charm she wore like armor. Around her, the weight of judgment pressed in. Doctor, Harris nodded respectfully toward John. We'll update you as soon as we know, he said, before turning and walking back through the doors. The families in the room shifted again, but this time their eyes were on John, not with pity but with respect. Some nodded quietly, others reached out to pat his shoulder. He had not just spoken for himself. He had spoken for every quiet sacrifice too often overlooked, every truth buried under show. And for the first time in days, John felt his chest lighten, not because the battle was won, but because the truth was no longer his burden alone. The surgery took hours. Time in the waiting room stretched thin, every minute marked not by a clock's hand but by the rise and fall of hope and fear. John Miller sat with his fingers laced, the envelope tucked securely in his jacket, as if its presence could anchor him through the storm. When the doors finally opened, Dr. Harris emerged, his face lined but carrying a weary smile. He made it, he said simply. The surgery went well. He's not out of the woods yet, but he's stable. He has a real chance. The room exhaled as one. Whispers of relief rippled through the families gathered there. John closed his eyes, the words he made it echoing like a hymn. He rose to his feet and followed the doctor down the hallway, past the machines and hushed voices, into the room where his son now lay. David looked fragile still, but there was color in his cheeks, a steady rhythm on the monitor. His chest rose and fell, no longer in jerks, but in something closer to peace. John sank into the chair beside him, the one he had kept vigil in for endless nights. He reached out and took his son's hand once more. You fought, he whispered. Just like I knew you would, and I'll keep fighting for you as long as I've got breath. He leaned back, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his heart carried a quiet triumph. He thought of Margaret and whispered softly to the memory of his late wife. He's still here, Maggie. Our boy's still here. Outside, Ashley lingered, her friends gone, her phone quiet. She stood at a distance, no longer the center of the story. The spotlight she had sought had faded, leaving only the truth and the quiet dignity of a father who never asked for applause. In that sterile room, John knew one thing with certainty. Love is not proven in words or in pictures or in parties. Love is proven in sacrifice, in the long nights, in the silent giving when no one is watching. That was the legacy he carried. That was the inheritance he hoped his son would understand when he woke. He bent closer to David, voice low and steady. Love is sacrifice, son. Never forget that. It's not in the crowd cheering you on. It's in the one person who stays when everyone else leaves. The monitor beeped steadily. The room was warm with the first light of dawn. John sat there in quiet vigil, not as a man broken, but as a father whose truth had finally been spoken. Dear viewers, thank you for joining us for this story here on Family Shadows. These stories remind us that dignity, sacrifice, and quiet justice still matter in a world too quick to forget them. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us for more. Folded hands until next time, may health, peace, and happiness be with you and your family.